long before we had a lot of the tools we have today. In fact, all the probably too many tools that we have today. So anyway, let's look at conditional completion actions, and this is something that I'm really excited about, and something that I know a lot of us have been asking for a long time. I think it was 2 years ago I was talking with product management at Pardot about this feature, and they were asking me how I might use it, and I gave them, I don't know, I probably, choked up, hundreds of ideas to them about all the different ways we can use it. But I'm interested very much to hear what other people have come up with now that it is available and we can see what it's giving us. So with that said, my disclaimers, I could be wrong on anything I'm saying here today. Not everybody, we all haven't had enough chance to look at all of this stuff yet. So a lot of these things are things that are theoretically possible, but not everything have I tested. So consider this a first look, and always, always, always my mantra, test everything. Do not assume that just because Pardot will let you do it, that will actually work. So those are the disclaimers. And again, I'm interested to hear what other people have come up with. So let's talk about first, basically types of automation that we have available to us in Pardot. So the first one is automation rules, and let's for the purposes of our conversation today, let's think about what those automations can do for us. So the first thing, automation rules allow us to do a complex input. It allows us to give us the ability to define a very, very specific condition that defines whether or not someone should have that automation run on them. And it gives us one single complex output on that. So you could actually have, because of the match any condition on the inputs, you could have many possible inputs, but only one output. Only one output is possible in an automation rule. So basically you could have a variety of ways that it could match, but the actual output is only one thing. You can only do one set of things. Now, one of the things that's come up about the conditional completion actions is the limits that have been placed on how many things you can do in a conditional completion action. We'll get to that in a second. But out of curiosity this morning, I built an automation rule to see how many actions I could put on one automation rule, and I gave up at 50. So you can put at least 50 actions on an automation rule should you find 50 things you want to do. The other limitation with an automation rule is you really can only repeat it once a day. That's the sort of you can repeat it less than once a day, but meaning once every 2 days or 3 days or a week or whatever, but you can't do it any more frequently than once a day if you want to repeat it. So that's a limitation of that. The second thing is engagement studios. And I think Christina and I have talked about this before. One of my favorite hacks with an engagement studio is don't think of it as a thing to send an email. Think of it as just a thing you can use to automate something. So again, an engagement studio allows you to have complex inputs because you could have multiple input lists, either dynamic or static. So you can have multiple input streams. And then, of course, then you can have these multiple outputs based on how you want to branch and logic, put your logic into your engagement studio. So you can, subject to the number of node limit on the engagement studio, which is about 250 nodes. You can do many inputs and then multiple in discrete outputs from an engagement studio. But again, you're limited to it repeating only once a day at maximum. So the last thing now that we have available to us is the conditional completion action. Now, you always did have a completion action as a type of automation, but now conditional gives us a little bit of logical capability in the completion action. But we're limited to the fact that it's a relatively simple input. Okay, we can only have one condition for each group that we can define with a little bit of tricks that we can apply to that. But basically it's one condition per group. We can have multiple outputs because we can have multiple things happen based on whatever that input is. But the repeat is we can repeat as often as that object is accessed. So we could run people through a conditional completion action as many times a day as we wanted, as long as they did the thing that caused it to run. So that's sort of the differences between the types as far as how we should be thinking about them. Oh, we have some chats. Break out. Okay. Christina, you let me know if there's anything coming up in the chat that we should be stopping for.
Absolutely. It sounds like there was some topic of automation spaghetti happening during one of the breakout room sessions. So.
Well, we're going to actually talk about automation spaghetti a little bit. So where can you use a completion action? Essentially, it's in forms, form handlers, a landing page that has a form. It's not it was available in list emails, but not it is available in list emails, but not conditionally yet. So that's a limitation. You cannot use the conditional completion actions in list builders. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. That seems to be the case from what I saw. Custom redirects, yes, it's in there now. File access and page actions, yes. However, when we look at do we want to use it or not, I would say really we would be best to consider its use only in the context of forms and form handlers and forms on landing pages. Custom redirects, file access, and page actions have very limited use cases because they require a cookie to be in place, and you don't always know that there's a cookie in place on a prospect, especially these days. And especially with the multiple, potentially multiple devices interacting with your content, as well as the fact that we cannot. One of the nice things that would be nice about conditional completion actions would be, is there a cookie or not? But no, that's not one of the choices available to us. So where are they used? This is where they're used, and I'll share these slides. I'll share these slides with the community afterward via Christina. All right. Next thing. So let's look at what are we limited by? What are the rules here? So the basic rules that we want to remember are 1, 6, 15. So the one means basically there's one condition available per group. There are 6 groups available, plus something I'm calling group 0, which is basically you can put in completion actions that are outside of the groups that applies to everybody. So you can have conditions that are only applicable if they meet the group criteria, but you can also have ones that are just generally applied. And let's call that group 0. So those are you can have maximum 6 groups. And then you have 15 rules, and you can use these 15 rules across any of those 7 boxes on the left, but only 15. So use them wisely because there's only 15 that you get. The other thing that I found interesting when I was looking over the documentation was this statement that says completion actions don't execute in a defined order to build a sequential prospect experience using Engagement Studio program. So when I was talking 2 years ago with product management, they were sort of telling me that the completion actions back then fired in the order in which they appeared in the on the object, but maybe that was true and maybe it wasn't. But in any case, at this point, this guidance says essentially they're just going to fire in a random, they're going to fire in a random order. So, I guess bear that in mind if you were considering, trying to structure this in some way. It doesn't really matter. You're not going to be able to control in what order they happen. And in theory, again, like the old completion actions is these are immediate to the extent that Pardot does anything immediately. So those are the kind of the parameters that we're meant to deal with with this new capability. So when we're thinking about how to use a conditional completion action, here are some considerations that I came up with that we should be thinking about. Number one, it's the instant action versus a delayed action. And what I mean by that is to say, there are things we want to do instantly. For example, sending autoresponders is generally something we want to do instantly, versus something that we can get away with being delayed. And maybe we want to use some kind of a secondary action to do things where it doesn't matter if it's delayed. The repeating requirement, like I mentioned before, if you have a need to have something repeat, repeat over over an interval of less than 1 day, then this might be a good capability to look at. How many variations do you have and what you're trying to do? Like we said, you've got 6 choices. You've got 6 plus 0 options that you have to look at. So you have to look at how many different things do I need to do, and how can I accomplish that within the constraint of these limits. So we have to start think about how we're sort of grouping things that we want to do, and then we can start thinking about, okay, if we can group things together in these characteristics, then we can look at how do we chain automation techniques together to get what we want if our situation is not simple. So if we have a relatively complicated objective as a result of our form fill, for example, how can we chain other automation techniques to this conditional completion action in order to accomplish our goal? So here, given those things, here are some things that I came up with as ideas and tips that from what I've been able to discover so far. So the first one is make use of that contains and does not contain instead of is or isn't in some cases, because what that allows you to do is if you've got an option where the dropdown has many possibilities, it can allow you to use multiple values from the dropdown to feed a single output if that fits your use case. So for example, on the right side here, this is an actual, the names have been changed to protect the client, but this is someone's dropdown, and they just happen to have 8 choices in the dropdown, and they had 6 endpoints that they were looking to notify. So in this case, on only one of these options were you really interested in telling sales about it. The rest of them were everything that wasn't sales. And I know a lot of you have this scenario, especially in B2B, where the form has the sales option, but the form has other options that aren't sales. So in this case, the third option down, or the first and the third option have 2 choices from the dropdown that feed them. So so this was a way to say how get 8 options, basically 8 options in the dropdown into 6 choices in the completion actions. Now you'll notice that my dropdown probably didn't say else, and it probably didn't say media. It had more than that. So what I did here was, we looked for mutually exclusive words in the dropdowns choices, so that we could say the reason contains sales. Well, only one of the options contains sales, so obviously that is the option that we wanted to route to that conditional parameter. Now the reason for this is, this is the idea of finding a mutually exclusive single word in the dropdown. We can use the semicolon method to delimit our choices, but you only have 250 characters. So, and because our conditional completion action only allows you one thing to say, so this contains 250 characters of options. So my recommendation, as always, with trying to do delimited lists, is to use this lovely little Sercante tool from my good friend Mike Cruiser, to take your list and delimit it into a nice chunk that is no more than 250 characters, because if you paste more than 250 characters into a field for contains, it will truncate the last option, and you might get a very unexpected result on that. So that's just a little things I've learned the hard way kind of tip. Don't paste into that field unless you're certain that value that you're pasting is under 250 characters. So anyway, so you can use this to break up and group values from a single dropdown into a choice that allows you to pick more than one option for that dropdown in your completion rule. So again, some ways to think about this. I think one, we should think about, what do we want to do for everyone? What do we want to do for most people, and see if we can group that into most people. And then, are there things that we want for specific people? Are there rules that we want to apply only to specific people, but are there other things that we want to just apply to everybody? And how can we allocate our resource, our scarce resource of 15 choices among 6 groups plus 0? How do we group those together? So here's some ideas for how to use this feature in some ways that might be interesting. So one of them would be a conditional resubscribe. So because a form allows you to send an autoresponder, even to someone who's unsubscribed, you could, this is an augmentation to the resubscribe capability. You could use an action that says, if the person is opted out, send them the autoresponder for the resubscribe and invite them to, yay, you're unsubscribed, would you like to resubscribe? So there's a potential way to use this, but only if the person is opted out. And I've made suggestions of how to create this capability outside of conditional resubscribe, and now it's there. It's just, now we can just do it. It can be one of our rules if we want it to be. So that's much easier than the workaround that I come up with a couple of years ago. Here's another one that I think is a very common use case that a lot of people don't think about it. It's what if someone who's a contact in the CRM fills out a contact us form? We have to make sure that the owner of that record knows that they filled out a contact us form, because in a lot of cases, the completion actions that we put in are designed around creating a new lead. But what if that person is already there? So this would allow us then to make sure that we can create a specific task against the CRM owner if the person who just filled this out is already a contact. So I think that's a really nice, a lot of times I would do this with an automation rule or a engagement studio. This allows you to just stick a complete conditional completion action in here to notify only if the person who filled out this form is already a contact, to notify the owner that it happened. So I think that's a really nice and easy use case for this feature. This is another thing that it's not part of conditional completion actions, but you can use it along with it. That I think I think it's a feature that people forget about, and I love it. A field can have a built-in add to a list option on it. So this is actually this showing here is the interface this is the interface in the custom field building element of Pardot, but or whatever we're calling it, MCAE, I don't know. I can't get used to. I've probably called it Pardot 25 times already. So this basically, if you do it in the when you're creating the field, this becomes then the default if you pick the default values in that drop down. So if you pick apples, it puts you on the group favorite fruit is apples, or oranges and bananas and so on. You can also do this with any field, any drop-down field that you put into a Pardot MK form. And you can override what the default is. But if you do it this way, then you never have to remember that, oh, right, this field is supposed to populate these lists. So this might be a way if a drop down in your form has a specific discrete set of outputs that you want to track, you want to drive additional automations off of, do it this way, and then have the automations run off this choice rather than using the conditional completion action. So that's another one where if it doesn't matter that it's immediate, maybe you can use this feature to get more mileage out of the limitations that you have in the conditionals by saying, well, if somebody fills out this form and they picked apples, then I'm gonna put them in the apple promotional list or the orange promotional list. And I don't have to use my conditional completion actions for that. So, or you have it, drive an automation of some kind and so on. So that's a nice thing that we always had. It's sort of like a conditional completion action now that you look at what we're getting, but it's a thing that people forget is even there. Another option is you could treat customers differently from other people. So if because you have access to the account field, if maybe you had an account field that was something that indicated whether they were a customer or what kind of a customer they were, you could have add them to a list for customers. You could send an autoresponder that was customer related. You could take some other action, notification, etc. But specific to if somebody was a customer versus not a customer. So there's another thing, because you have access to that account field. Again, this implies they were already in your system. So you can take actions based on people's disposition in your system differently than if they were just a random new person coming up into your system. So here's an example of pairing is and isn't, which would be how to do our event RSVP gatekeeper on your form. So this says I have a list called invited to the event. That's everybody that I'm inviting to the event. But because people pass stuff along, or it might be on your website or whatever, or you might want to create some kind of a waiting list for the event for whatever reason. This says if they're a member of the invited list, then send them the confirmation. But if they're not a member of the list, then send them an autoresponder that says, hey, we got your registration, you're on the wait list, we'll let you know if we're gonna have room. So this is using that as an is and isn't thing, basically off of the same list, which I think is a nice way. And this is a nice use case for how do you put a form out in the wild, but only let people RSVP who you wanted to RSVP, but then do something otherwise for everyone else that isn't just ignoring them. Now, I want to make a point here. This is not the same condition as the previous slide. So the previous slide had two groups, right? The dark gray is the group. This is not the same thing. So this shows you what it looks like when you've got basically condition 0. This is group 0 up here, this action. That would apply to everybody. So be careful when you're doing this to make sure that you're either using the conditional group versus if it's not in the conditional group, and you can put these above or below also. So be careful there. You can put them above or below where they're outside of a group, and it applies to everyone. So this one would send the waitlist autoresponder to everybody, including the people that matched the condition in the gray box. So this is just one of those be careful, kind of things, and test everything.
Bill, quick question.
Mm-hmm.
You said that you could add the group above or below your, I guess we could call it the default or the one that will go to everyone. Because what you said earlier that there's no necessarily like order of operations. it doesn't necessarily matter if it's done before or after, correct?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. And let's actually just look at what that looks like in reality. So let's I'm just going to pull. I've been playing with this demo work. So let's just look at the completion actions on this form. So let's look at what that looks like in an actual. So this is where I left it off. So this group here, this group is that group, dark gray group I was talking about. So there is the thing that applies to everybody above, and then here are the things that apply to everybody below. So the dark gray or the light gray group is the things that only apply if the condition is met. Okay, so these are the things that are below and above the conditions, and you can put these in wherever, and you can add a conditional group wherever. And I think let's try it. Let's add another action here just for the sake of. And now let's add a conditional group. Okay. So this has got one in the middle. So this is not, it's not going to restrict you. You're going to be able to do this kind of now it doesn't matter because the stuff's going to fire in random order, but it's a warning to be careful when you're setting these up that you didn't, whoops, I stuck one of these in the middle because I forgot to hit conditional group. Now, when you save this, it's going to give you a list, as it always did, of the actions and the conditional parameters. Okay, but see, so the way that this is grouping, it's kind of putting them in this. You can see that it's threading them. There's a light gray line, and then a white, and then light gray, and then light. But it's not real obvious from looking at that I've got, that I've got two conditional groups and two things that apply to everybody. So just super be careful, right? So that's, yeah, again, test everything. Make sure that you've got everything in there. Okay, so another option, if people meet a certain criteria, selectively send them to Salesforce. If you have a bunch of people coming into your system and you don't necessarily want to send everybody to Salesforce as leads, well, build in some condition that defines whether or not they should go to Salesforce. So this example shows that if they're, let's say you had a list of people in there that were new prospects, maybe they were from a show or something, and you were marketing to them and you wanted to see if they responded before we actually gave them sales. So this one suggests that if they come through this form and they were on that list of people that we were actively interested in, then send them to Salesforce, or any other condition that you might select. Maybe again, if it was the contact us form, only if they selected sales, send them to Salesforce, and don't send anybody else to Salesforce. So those are some other possibilities there. Another one that I like, which is don't give salespeople stuff they don't need to see, because they don't like it, and then they blame you. So another thing, again, I think people don't use as often as they might is tags. Tags are, again, they're only useful in MCAE, Pardot, but they're a nice way for you to flag something to take an action on, and then you can either leave them there or take them off. So for example, this one, if the favorite fruit is apples, then I want to add this tag that's going to signal to the automation rule. I need to run the automation rule for apples, for the Apple automation. And then I put them on a list. So that's another possibility, is we have tags that are adding people to dynamic lists, that are adding people automations, that are adding people, that are basically kicking off that chain of additional automations. I like this doing this better as a kickoff for an automation rather than the function in an automation of has filled out X form, because of the way that automations work. you have to put in a limitation on the time, a timeline, and it's not explicit to that form. So in an automation rule, if you say has filled out X form and last activity is less than 1 day, that usually gets you what you need, but not always, because they could have some other activity and it wasn't the form, because that has filled out the form thing applies to have they ever filled out the form. So this tagging to trigger an automation is a more reliable way to flag that person has actually filled out this form. So we should kick off this automation at that point. So I like that method better than using has they filled out the form on the automation as an option, because you have to put in that time element. Otherwise the thing runs every day, and that's not good either.
Bill, we had a couple questions come in. One was from Sage. I believe the answer to this question is yes, but I wanted to see what you had experienced thus far. So Sage asked, will this also work based on form field completion act? So for example, like if someone fills out a field on the form, on that same form, will these completion actions fire?
It's form field based. So yes, because you can say, have they, did they answer sales to the example that I gave earlier. Let's check back to that. This example here, this was based on the form, basically what they answered on the form. Which choice did they make in the form drop down, and then take the actions on that basis. Be careful if you've got multi-selects, because that's another thing where, that could fire, and you didn't intend it to. Because the other thing about this is that the conditional completion actions, if you have multiple rules and the person meets all the rules, they will get all the completion actions. It's not just the first one they meet, they get that. Does it meet this? Yes or no? Does it meet that one? Yes or no? Does it meet that one? Yes or no? So you could have a series of these where people meet more than one, and that might serve a purpose, or it might cause a problem. So, yeah. So is blank? I saw that one. Is blank? That's a good one. That's a good question. Let's look at that. I don't know. I haven't tried that one yet. I have a feeling the answer to that is no. And the reason for that is blank isn't a good indication of an answer. Usually you want to make it on some condition, because if it's blank, it could be that the field didn't get filled out or whatever. So prospect, let's see. Let's just look at custom field. Oh, is empty. Okay, it's empty. Yeah, okay. So the answer is yes, you can't do that. It's empty. If the field is empty, then do this. That's date. Let's look at one that's the fruit is empty. So if they didn't answer the question, yes, you can use blank, but it's not blank, it's empty. So
Justin had a question around for fields that record multiple responses. Will it query each value in the fields?
Yeah, well, again, it will look at. This is another one where I think you should test it. If you use the contains, it's going to look and see if it can find any of the things in those multiple responses. If you use contains, if you use is, I don't know what the behavior is going to be, because if they have more than one thing, it is, and you have two things, right? I don't know. That's a good one for, we're gonna have to test that one. I don't know how that one will behave at all. But that's a great one. That's a great one for yeah, that's gotta, I personally, I don't like multi-selects because they're hard to work with in Salesforce. They're hard to work with in Salesforce because there's different ways it can interpret them. It can either interpret them as discrete individual answers, or it can interpret them as a list of answers, depending on how you've set it up. And I guess there's reasons to use it in both ways, depending on what your situation is. But it's often difficult to interpret what is meant by it. For example, if it represents two answers given on two different occasions, how do you know which one came first? For example, that's always the first thing that I go to when we talk about allowing multiple responses in the same field. How do I know which one came first? Or if you set it up so that it's giving you a string of answers, then your reporting gets off, because it's saying, well, one of the responses is apples, oranges, as well as apples, oranges, and bananas. You also have apples, oranges, and apples, bananas, and oranges, bananas as a single answer. So you end up getting these wonky reports in some cases, again, depending on how it's set up. I had two other examples here, which we could go to quick. One of them was, and this comes up from time to time, people are like, I want to use the same I want to use the same form on, I want to use the same form on my site. I don't want to use 5 forms, but so I want to run everybody through the same form, but I want to know where it came from. So one possibility, if you're using an iFrame on a Pardot, on a MCAE Pardot form, is you put a hidden variable in it'd be adding this variant equals 1 thing on the end of it when you're doing the iFrame embed, and then put a hidden field on your form that's looking at that. Now, it's always going to be the same depending on which page it came from, but it allows you to use the same form multiple times, but say I have variant 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And it says, okay, variant 5 I know came from the demo page, and variant 3 I know came from the landing page, and variant 2 came from the product page, or whatever. So, and then it would allow you potentially to run some kind of conditional action from which page variant the thing came from, but essentially use the same form for every page, because the variable is the only thing that changes here. The rest of the embed that you're putting in the iframe is the same. And then one other thing that I think is a potentially interesting use case here is if you use form handlers as a link, if you've ever used that technique, basically, a form handler, essentially, if they click the link, they get in effect a form handler submission. And you can use, if you're sending an email, you can use merge fields as the variables in that. So, for instance, if you're sending a list email and you've got people with all different types of characteristics, and maybe one of them is whether they're a customer or not. So one of those options that you hide in that link is whether they're a customer or not. So they click that, and the conditional action on the handler is do something different for the customer versus the non-customer or whatever. So this would be an interesting use case for using form handlers. With conditional actions, because you can do that. Or you could use the same form handler with 2 different buttons, for example, and the buttons have hard-coded choice answer 1 and answer 2. And again, the form handler's conditional actions are looking for which button was pressed. And then it can take a different action on the basis of like, again, maybe it's an RSVP for an event, and the button 1 is yes, I'm coming, and button 2 was no, I'm not coming. So the conditional handler is saying, okay, if they're coming, we put them on the RSVP list. If they're not coming, we put them on the decline list. So so that's another way that everything goes through the same handler, and then the two conditional actions are different. So those are the examples I came up with. I'm sure there are plenty more, but those are some things that I was able to think of as we got this feature available to us. Do we have other thoughts or questions that have come up?
Not as of yet, but a couple thoughts that were just hopping around in my head. So I will stop the recording.